In a world that celebrates visibility, we rarely question the hidden cost of being constantly available. We are trained, socially, emotionally, even spiritually, to remain open, to answer the phone, to reply to the message, to offer the shoulder, the ear, the advice, to make ourselves emotionally accessible, even when we are running on empty. But what if this availability is not a virtue? What if, beneath the surface of this social grace, lies a silent self-betrayal? What if always being available is a symptom of unresolved fear? Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of not being needed. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how can we become if we are constantly fragmented? How can we grow inwardly if all our psychic energy is bleeding outward? There is a quiet rebellion taking place in the hearts of those who are beginning to choose conscious unavailability, not as a cold rejection of others, but as a sacred protection of self. This is not about becoming distant, bitter, or avoidant. It's about becoming deliberate. Because energy, like time, is a finite resource, and who you give your energy to shapes who you become. From a young age, many of us were taught, implicitly or explicitly, that love must be earned, that to be safe, we must be agreeable, that to be accepted, we must be emotionally accessible at all times. So we became experts at reading the room, at tuning into other people's moods while muting our own, at offering pieces of ourselves to keep the peace, to maintain connection, to be good. But in doing so, we made a quiet trade. We exchanged our inner truth for external harmony. We learned to abandon ourselves, not in dramatic gestures, but in small, daily silences. Every time we swallowed the words we needed to say. Every time we said yes when we meant no. Every time we allowed someone to pull from our well, even when it was dry. And now as adults, we feel the residue of that self-abandonment. We feel it in the heaviness of always being on. We feel it in the guilt that arises when we try to say no. We feel it in the exhaustion of being everything to everyone, and yet still somehow not enough for ourselves. But here's the truth. You were not born to be emotionally available to everyone. You were born to be whole. And wholeness requires boundaries, not as punishment, not as a form of superiority, but as a container for your becoming. To be consciously unavailable is to reclaim your energy, to recognize that you are not a public park open to all hours and all people. You are a sacred temple, and access to your emotional space must be earned, not assumed. This is not selfish. This is self-honoring, because when you are always accessible, you become energetically diluted. You lose the depth of your own voice amidst the noise of others. You forget how to sit in stillness. You forget how to hear yourself think. And without that inner dialogue, there is no individuation. Jung taught that individuation is the process of becoming one's true self. It is not conformity. It is not performance. It is the courageous peeling away of false selves, inherited roles, and projected identities. But individuation requires psychic energy, deep reserves of attention, awareness, and solitude, and that energy cannot coexist with compulsive availability. So the question becomes, who are you when you stop overextending? Who are you when you no longer shape yourself to fit into everyone else's emotional puzzle? Who are you when you allow silence to speak louder than your accommodating smile? This isn't a script for isolation, it's a script for discernment. Because not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Not every hand that reaches out deserves to be held. Not every crisis is yours to fix. And not every request for your energy is aligned with your evolution. Some are distractions. Some are distortions. Some are dressed as connection, but are actually emotional theft. To be consciously unavailable is to recognize this and to act accordingly, with grace, with clarity, with power. In the next chapter, we'll explore how trauma wires us to become over-available. We'll look at the false sense of self born from abandonment, the subtle manipulations of emotional enmeshment, and why conscious unavailability is often the first step toward true healing. But for now, remember this. You are not a resource to be mined. You are a soul to be honored. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for others is to disappear from their expectations long enough to reappear as your truth. To understand why we struggle with boundaries, we must first go back, not just to childhood memories, but to the emotional contracts we silently signed long before we knew we had a choice. Many of us were raised in environments where love was conditional, where affection was inconsistent, where our emotional needs were either neglected or manipulated. And from these environments, we developed a subconscious belief: I must be useful to be loved. This is where overavailability is born, not from generosity, but from survival, not from wholeness, but from the fear of being discarded. If you had a parent who was emotionally volatile, you may have become hypervigilant, constantly monitoring their moods, tiptoeing through your own emotions, trying to be whatever they needed so you wouldn't be punished or ignored. If your worth was tied to performance, being the smart one, the helpful one, the good one, you likely learned to suppress your own needs in favor of being what others expected. This is emotional enmeshment, and it is the breeding ground of self-abandonment. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear to adapt to society. But for those raised in emotionally unsafe environments, the persona isn't just a mask. It becomes a prison. We begin to believe that the mask is us, that the agreeable, always there, always helpful version of ourselves is our true identity, that without this role, we are unworthy. And so, even as adults, we carry this wounded pattern into our relationships. We say yes to things we resent. We stay in conversations that drain us. We give advice when we need silence. We become therapists to people who never once asked how we are. But let's be clear, this is not love. This is not kindness. This is trauma in costume, because real love does not require self-erasure. Real connection does not demand your constant emotional availability as proof of your value. When someone is drowning in their own unconscious patterns, they will often cling to the most empathic, most spiritually open person around. And if you don't have boundaries, they will pull you under with them. Not out of malice, but because that's what unhealed people do. They reach for energy they haven't earned. This is why conscious unavailability is an act of both compassion and courage. It is compassionate because it refuses to participate in codependency. It is courageous because it requires you to tolerate the discomfort of disappointing others, of not being liked, of being misunderstood. To be consciously unavailable is to say, I will not betray myself just to soothe your discomfort. I am not your emotional sponge. My love is not measured by how much of myself I sacrifice. Jung also wrote of the shadow, the unconscious parts of the psyche we deny or suppress. Overavailability often hides a deep shadow, the desire to control how others see us, the fear of being seen as selfish, the terror of being perceived as cold or uncaring. But until we integrate this shadow, we remain emotionally enslaved by the need to be nice. And niceness, without boundaries, is a form of spiritual leakage. You can be kind without being accessible. You can be loving without being available 24/7. You can be generous without being depleted. You were not born to be a container for everyone else's unprocessed pain. You were born to become yourself. But becoming yourself requires psychic space. And psychic space requires boundaries. And boundaries require the willingness to be unavailable, to not answer the call, to not respond to the guilt trip, to not rush to save people from problems they created. This is not abandonment. This is alignment. Because every yes to someone else is a no to something inside you. And too many no's to yourself leads to a quiet kind of death. In the next part, we'll explore the subtle art of detachment. We'll look at how to emotionally unhook from draining dynamics, the difference between compassion and codependency, and how to cultivate a new kind of presence, one that is rooted, sovereign, and deeply unavailable to anything that costs your peace. But before we continue, ask yourself this: where in your life have you confused being loved with being needed? Where have you mistaken self-abandonment for generosity? And what would it feel like to choose yourself? Not out of defiance, but out of devotion. There comes a moment in the life of every sensitive, giving person when the exhaustion can no longer be denied. You begin to feel it in your body. A tightening in the chest when your phone lights up. A subtle dread when someone asks, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" A bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to cure. This isn't just burnout, it's a soul signal. Your psyche whispering, "This is not sustainable." And so begins the work of detachment, not the cold, indifferent kind that numbs your heart, but the sacred kind, the kind that liberates you from false responsibility, the kind that allows you to witness someone's suffering without confusing it for your assignment. We must learn to hold space without losing ourselves, to be present without absorbing, to care without carrying. This is where discernment enters, a quiet, often uncomfortable intelligence that asks, is this truly mine to hold? Is this my emotion or someone else's? Am I offering help or avoiding my own discomfort by rushing to fix? Many people mistake empathy for enmeshment, but real empathy does not mean dissolving your boundaries into another's pain. It means recognizing their pain without rehearsing it in your body. Carl Jung warned against the unconscious desire to rescue others, calling it a projection of our own disowned parts. Sometimes we help not because the other person truly needs it, but because we need to feel useful, needed, worthy, and in doing so, we rob them of their growth. We interfere with their individuation. Helping someone too early, too often, or too intensely is not compassion. It is control. And it is often rooted in a fear that if we are not needed, we are not loved. This is why detachment is an act of deep spiritual maturity. It says, I trust you to find your own path. I release the illusion that I must suffer for you to heal. I choose to be a witness, not a savior. In many traditions, the most powerful healers are not the ones who fix you, but the ones who sit beside you and hold presence. They do not interfere with your process. They simply create space for your soul to breathe. But to do this, you must first reclaim your sovereignty. Sovereignty means owning your psychic energy. It means recognizing that your attention is a currency, that your time is sacred, that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. You are not here to be everything to everyone. You are here to become something real to yourself. Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become who you truly are if you are constantly shape-shifting to accommodate others. You cannot hear your own soul when your energy is entangled in everyone else's noise. Conscious unavailability is the path back to yourself. It is a quiet rebellion against the culture of performance. It is a sacred refusal to betray your inner world for the comfort of others. As you practice this, people will resist. Some will guilt you. Some will call you selfish. Some will try to reclaim the old version of you, the one who was always accessible, always agreeable, always on. Let them. Let them grieve the version of you that no longer exists. Let them confront their discomfort. Let them walk away if they must. Your job is not to keep the peace at the expense of your own. Your job is to stay loyal to your soul. But for now, ask yourself, what would it feel like to stop managing other people's emotions? To let go of being the emotional caretaker? To be fully unapologetically rooted in your own energy for once? That is where your real power begins. There is a sacred power in stepping back, not as an act of punishment, not as manipulation, but as medicine. In a world addicted to immediacy, silence becomes radical, withdrawal becomes alchemical, and distance becomes clarity. When you withdraw your energy, truly, intentionally, you begin to feel just how much of yourself was scattered. You notice how often your thoughts orbited others, how much of your peace depended on whether someone else texted you back, how many times you entered conversations you didn't have the energy for, just to avoid being seen as cold. You start to recognize the places where your presence became a placeholder for other people's avoidance. And then, something profound happens. You begin to gather yourself. Carl Jung spoke of withdrawal of projections as a core part of individuation. We spend much of our lives projecting, our unlived lives onto lovers, our unmet needs onto friends, our suppressed rage onto strangers. But when you withdraw, when you create space, you start to own those projections. You realize the person you were trying to fix was actually a symbol of your own unhealed self. You see that your obsession wasn't love, it was a longing for wholeness. You understand that what felt like rejection was actually redirection from your soul. This is the alchemy of absence. When you pull your energy inward, everything that is not aligned falls away. What remains is what is true. You begin to hear the quiet voice beneath the noise, not the voice of fear or obligation or social conditioning, but the voice of your inner knowing. It often says very simple things. This is draining you. You don't have to answer right now. Walk away. Rest. But when you are constantly entangled in the world, always replying, always fixing, always reacting, you can't hear it. Withdrawal is not weakness. It is recalibration. It is psychic hygiene. It is your soul calling you back from the edges where you've overextended, back to the center, back to the self. When you become conscious of how your presence affects the field, you stop giving it away freely. You realize your energy is not neutral. It is influence. It is power. It is prayer. The mystics and sages across time understood this well. They often retreated into solitude, not to escape the world, but to remember who they were before the world told them who to be. Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, Christ in the desert, Nietzsche walking alone through the mountains, Jung in his tower at Bollingen, building stone by stone in silence. Solitude is not loneliness. It is communion with your depth, your daimon, your divine design. In practical terms, conscious withdrawal might look like not responding immediately to messages, saying, "Let me get back to you," instead of "yes" on autopilot, leaving group chats or online spaces that drain your spirit, taking a break from being the emotional anchor in every relationship. It may seem small, but these are revolutionary acts in a culture that equates availability with value. The world will not applaud your absence, but your nervous system will, your inner child will, your future self will, because in absence, you are not abandoning others. You are reclaiming your essence. You are breaking the contract that says your worth is tied to your performance. You are finally learning to be with yourself. And that is where all real power begins. Not all boundaries are spoken. Some are felt. They exist not in words, but in frequency. Not in confrontation, but in vibration. They are the invisible fences of the soul, lines drawn not in sand, but in self-respect. We often talk about boundaries as things we must say. No, I'm not comfortable with that. I need space. But there is a deeper form of boundary, a more ancient, intuitive form, where the body speaks before the mouth ever moves. It is the way you no longer linger in draining conversations, the way your energy no longer hooks into chaotic dynamics, the way your eyes soften but no longer plead to be seen. This is energetic sovereignty. It is not defense, it is presence. When you become consciously unavailable, your energetic field begins to emit a new signal. That signal is clarity. It is a quiet, unwavering knowing. I am not here to be consumed. I am not available for chaos. I am no longer negotiating my peace. And others feel it. Even if they don't know why they suddenly hesitate to dump their emotional weight onto you. Even if they don't understand why their manipulations no longer land. Even if they still try to push, but somehow it doesn't work anymore. Because your energy is no longer reaching for them. Carl Jung described this dynamic through the lens of psychic energy. He believed that our attention, our psychic libido, flows where our inner orientation leads it. When we withdraw our projections, when we stop trying to fix, chase, or rescue, that energy returns to its source, to you. Suddenly, you are no longer trying to control external narratives. You're no longer managing other people's perceptions of you. You're no longer enmeshed in psychic contracts that say, if I stay small, maybe you'll stay close. That is not love. That is a trauma bond, and it ends the moment your energy says no more. Energetic boundaries are often forged in silence, not the silence of repression, but the silence of deep listening. You begin to notice how your body contracts when you're betraying your truth, how your heart tightens around people who perform affection but offer no safety, how your soul aches when you're constantly giving but rarely received, and slowly, without fanfare, you start choosing differently. You leave before you're exhausted. You speak less but mean more. You show up less often but with more depth. This kind of boundary doesn't require declarations. It doesn't require explanations, because it's not about them. It's about you becoming aligned with your own energy. When a person with energetic boundaries walks into a room, something shifts. They are not guarded, but they are grounded. They are not closed, but they are clear. They don't resist life, but they don't allow themselves to be used as a sponge for other people's unconsciousness. They hold their center, and in doing so, they give others permission to find their own. You might lose people who thrived on your availability, people who expected access without reciprocity, people who mistook your kindness for consent. Let them go. What remains will be real. What enters will meet you at your level. What grows will be rooted, not rushed, because you are no longer moving from emptiness. You are moving from overflow. And that is the most sacred boundary of all. To be hard to reach is not to be arrogant. It is to be structured, It is to build a life that doesn't revolve around reaction, but revolves around intention. To be hard to reach means that your attention is no longer public property. It is sacred real estate. And not everyone gets a key. In today's hyper-connected world, availability has become a kind of currency. We're told that being constantly responsive is synonymous with being caring, engaged, or successful. But what if the opposite is true? What if your power doesn't lie in how fast you respond, but in how deeply you remain rooted? What if conscious unavailability is not a rejection of others, but a reclamation of yourself? Think of the most centered people you've ever met. They do not rush. They do not chase. They are not frantic with their energy. There is space between stimulus and response, space between someone's expectation and their own truth. And in that space lives discernment, the ability to know what deserves your attention, what simply doesn't, and when the best response is no response at all. Carl Jung often warned against the dangers of inflation, of being overtaken by the unconscious, or by collective forces that erode the individual. To live reactively is to be inflated by the outer world. Your ego becomes porous. Your energy gets hijacked. But to become hard to reach is to reclaim your ego's shape, not to become rigid, but to become integrated. This is not selfishness. It is psychic hygiene. Let's put this into practical terms. You do not need to respond to every message instantly. Attend every gathering. Explain your inner process to people who haven't earned your trust. Stay connected to those who feel like emotional whirlpools. You are allowed to say, I'm not available for this right now. This conversation isn't nourishing for me. I need time in silence. Not because you're hiding, but because you're building. You're building something sacred, an inner cathedral, where your attention is an offering, where your energy has a gatekeeper, where your availability is earned, not assumed. This is spiritual architecture. It's the same reason ancient temples were hard to access, not because they wanted to exclude people, but because they wanted to preserve the sanctity of what lived inside. You are not an open hallway, you are a temple, and the more sacred your energy becomes, the more selective your access must be. Because spiritual evolution is not just about opening up, it's also about closing what once drained you. It's about no longer leaking yourself into spaces that dim your light, no longer volunteering for roles you've outgrown, no longer auditioning for love that requires your self-abandonment. To be hard to reach is to become energetically expensive, not in a superficial way, but in a deeply intentional way. It means that others must rise to meet you. It means that your time is not just time, it is life force, and you no longer give that away cheaply. Not all distance is created equal. Some distance is a trauma response. Other distance is a soul directive. The challenge lies in knowing the difference. Avoidance is fear disguised as protection. It whispers, if I get too close, I'll get hurt again. It builds walls, not out of wood or stone, but out of anxiety. It retreats not for reflection, but for escape. Avoidance makes you look unavailable, but in truth, you're entangled with the very thing you're trying to avoid. Sacred distance, however, is rooted in clarity. It says, I honor myself enough to know what I can hold and what I must release. It doesn't come from fear. It comes from integration. You are not reacting from a wound. You are responding from a centered self. Carl Jung taught that what we resist persists, but what we bring into consciousness, we can transform. Avoidance resists. Sacred distance witnesses. Avoidance turns its face away from the fire. Sacred distance walks through the fire and emerges with clearer boundaries. So how do you know if your unavailability is conscious? Ask yourself, am I creating space to regulate and reflect, or to suppress and disconnect? Do I feel empowered by this boundary, or secretly anxious beneath it? Is this solitude deepening my clarity, or hiding my fear of intimacy in it? Because here's the truth. Healing is not about becoming permanently inaccessible. It's about learning when to engage and when to withdraw, from a place of choice, not compulsion. You're not meant to live in isolation, but you are meant to move with discernment, to offer your presence like a rare stone, precious, intentional, and never performative. There's a kind of love that requires distance, not because you love less, but because the container of love becomes clearer with boundaries. You don't stop caring. You stop bleeding. You don't become indifferent. You become sovereign. You stop enabling the cycles that erode you and start aligning with relationships that reflect your depth. Sacred distance is not the absence of love. It's the refinement of it. It's the realization that some connections can only thrive with space, that the soul does not grow in chaos, but in intentional silence. And that's the essence of conscious unavailability. You are not withdrawing from life. You are withdrawing from noise, from chaos, from distortion, so that you can re-enter life not as a fragmented reaction, but as a whole presence. Now let me know in the comment box, what would your life be like when you choose isolation? If this message resonates with you, then drop a comment. Isolation is the key. Let's see how many here are ready for this transition. And don't forget, another video is coming soon.